The following is a production of KYNE TV in cooperation with UNO Television. Consider This with Carol Schrader, a news and informational program recorded on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hello and welcome to the Milo Bale Student Center at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. My guest today is Professor Sam Walker, Dr. Sam Walker, a longtime law enforcement professor here at UNO. And the reason I asked Sam to be here today is that policing is his specialty. He's been involved with documentaries on the History Channel, A&E, and we have some policing issues going on right in our community. So
major issues.
You get a chance to put some of your study and observations into play, and I'm sure people ask you all the time, what about things like how we handle investigations of police shootings? What about civil service protection for chiefs? What do you think is the hottest policing issue from your perspective here in Omaha right now?
Well, I think right now we ought to separate the immediate controversies, such as the recent Emmons shooting and all of the controversy over the release of the materials. Separate that from the really underlying issues about leadership in the police department. And I think there's a really serious problem at the moment regarding the leadership of the police department.
Well, we have an acting chief. Right. Jim Skinner left after many years on the force, and then about several years as chief. Right. And we have Charles Zirkle. Charlie Zirkle is acting chief, who has agreed to take his retirement when the new chief is found. And so pick up where you think there's significant things here.
Well, we need a permanent chief, a full-time chief at the moment, and I'm especially concerned about Mayor Daub's proposal to remove civil service protection from the police chief. Policing is a critically important function in government. I mean, the police have tremendous powers that you and I don't have, and so it's important to insulate them from direct political influence. Now, we have to really strike a balance here. We live in a democratic society, and the people really should control all the government agencies and the police in particular. So the mayor and city council need to have some direction and oversight of it. But at the same time, we need to give it a little bit of protection, from direct political influence.
Okay, well, I think when a lot of people think of political influence, they think of protecting the mayor's friends. I'm not talking about our current mayor, but I'm talking, sort of, or Chicago-style policing, where in New York, where they were you paid for protection. They came in and got their money, and they think those kinds of things are the political influences. But today, in 1990s, almost 2000 America, what political influences should we be wary of?
Well, I think any specific controversy where, let's say, some incident occurs and the mayor or somebody on city council wants something done about it, and in the best professional judgment of the police chief, that's not the thing to do. We need to insulate the police chief, from any kind of direct, direction or reprisals in that case. So we really need to give them some kind of protection. That's the reason most cities have civil service protection for the police chief, so that they can be fired really only for cause.
Well, currently, while we're taping this this afternoon, people will see this tonight, the administration, the city of Omaha, has been taken to court challenging the agreement that was reached between Mayor Daub and right now the fire chief so far and the head of 911, that they would give up their civil service protection. In other words, that they do have that protection by charter, but that they just could sort of acquiesce. Right. Because that's what the mayor wanted when he hired them, and evidently a citizen didn't think that was a good idea and took them to court, and so it's an odd situation right now.
It's a very odd situation, and I think it's creating this vacuum of leadership. I'm afraid the mayor is simply wrong on this issue. You can't act as though city charter doesn't exist and doesn't apply to him. The city charter clearly spells out civil service protection. What that means is that we can fire a police chief if there's clearly some misconduct, some dereliction of duty, and so on. But at the same time, that person is free to exercise his or her professional judgment to do what really needs to be done in terms of law enforcement.
What comes to mind, remember Chief Wadman.
Right.
Mayor Boyle tried to fire him.
Right.
Well, indeed fire him, and the courts said that wasn't right. You didn't have cause.
Yeah. Now, the alternative to...
Of course, that was a very politically charged issue, which is what you're talking about.
Very, very complex situation in that instance. Now, the alternative to civil service protection is a fixed-term contract. A number of cities have gone to that. Los Angeles has it. Minneapolis has it, for example, where police chief is hired with a fixed 3-year or 5-term contract. Now, I personally favor that, so that that person, when is hired, there's an understanding. Here, the mayor and city council can say, here are the things we want done. We want to do community policing, or maybe we don't want to do it. We want to do zero tolerance policing, maybe we don't. But that's agreed to in advance. Then that chief executive has 3 years or 5 years to implement his or her program. At the end of that period, you get a review, and you can decide whether or not to retain that person.
Well, isn't that what City Councilman Frank Brown wants, and the council has already held a hearing on and will vote on, I believe, next week, that this would be a contractual situation?
I think so. I haven't seen Frank Brown's specific proposal, so the initial press accounts, and again, those might be distorted, sort of indicated that there would be more power by City Council to remove a police chief. Again,
They do want a hand.
And they should. They should. The City Council is the representative of different parts of the community, and they should have some input in hiring the police chief. But I really feel very strongly about the need for a fixed-term contract, so that person is free to do what is important in his or her best professional judgment.
In other words, we've agreed on these goals, and I might have a performance evaluation somewhere in the meantime,
right,
as you would do with any CEO does, or any upper management, but I can go about it as they thought I could when they hired me.
Right. Well, I think that's the occurs at the contract renewal time. This is what happened in Los Angeles recently. After the Rodney King incident, they hired Willie Williams, who'd been police commissioner in Philadelphia. He came in, 5-year fixed-term contract. At the end of that period, the police commission, which runs the police department there, had decided that he really hadn't exercised sufficient leadership and really hadn't brought about the changes that need to be changed. And so his contract was not renewed, and they hired somebody else.
Police forces and fire departments are very unusual animals. I think it's because they spend so much intense time together in very intense situations, and there's an inner politics all their own. It's not like a normal company, a 9-to-5 job, and it gets very political within. And there's always a feeling sometimes that, particularly in police work, that and they have very strong unions, at least in most cities Omaha size or larger, that it's even hard for a police chief anywhere to manage now, given all those kinds of things. I mean, it's just a tough job.
Well, sure, it's a tough job. It's a big organization, and again, a lot of political pressures on it. But actually, around the country, there's an awful lot happening. Just tremendous change in policing. In fact, one of the leading experts in policing, David Bailey, who teaches at Albany, says this may be the most creative period in all of police history. And so the community policing movement is having a tremendous impact around the country.
But we don't believe that here.
Well, I think that's a mistake.
I mean, the official Dobb position is that community policing, and he talked about neighborhood parties or tea parties. I mean, he used some terms during the campaign to sort of.
Well, that's simply a mistake.
You could surf the web and easily understand what other cities are doing.
Let me give you an example. A year ago, I did an evaluation of the police in Albuquerque. Now, there's a department with some serious police community relations problems, but I met in the neighborhood with the director of the South Broadway Neighborhood Association, which is the poorest neighborhood in Albuquerque. A lot of drug trafficking. They had a lot of open street drug dealing, and she told me about her very positive relations with the police department, and how she supports the police. For example, would supported them on issue involving their salaries. Their salaries were very low, but they listened to her. It was a two-way street, and so there were specific police tactics that the department was going to engage in. They wanted to bring in some armored vehicle to fight drugs. And she called up the captain of the district and said, "No, wait a minute, that's not going to go in our neighborhood." And they listened. Mm-hmm. They listened to her, and so they pulled it out.
The amazing thing is that in Omaha, Nebraska, right now, depending on which precinct you go to, there is community policing, some very strong community policing going on, but we can't call it that.
Well, again, I think the important thing is this interaction between the police and community leaders, where it's a two-way street, and the police have to listen, and the police have to really build up these structures. Actually, I was sitting there talking to this, again, the leader of this neighborhood association, and I was a little skeptical at first, and I said, well, do you have his phone number? She says, I've got his office phone, I've got his beeper number, I've got his home number, I've got everything. And so I think there really was a very close kind of relationship there. So that's just one example of the kind of things that is occurring around the country, where the police are getting out of this sort of traditional insular, it's us versus them kind of attitude, and sitting down and really being much more open with the neighborhoods they're policing.
Well, bless their hearts, police officers today do feel, from everything I read, that although they have a lot of power, and they certainly have lethal force at their disposal, that they are almost like the Vietnam vet used to be when they came back. They are spat upon, there's no respect. When I grew up, I can't imagine what my mother, she would have just had a heart attack if I would have said anything to a police officer that I personally have seen yelled at police officers for no reason at all. I mean, it's not a pretty thing to be a police officer, even sometimes when you're just walking down the street, which is very, very sad. It must make the job very hard.
Well, yeah, it's a difficult job.
I think community policing might actually
help to overcome some of those traditional sort of conflicts between the police and the public. One of the things that I think is extremely important is that there are tremendous differences between police departments. I mean, we talk about the police this and the police that as if they're all the same. They're actually, departments are extremely different. This just in the last couple of months, I've had an opportunity to go to Portland and to Pittsburgh. Portland, excellent police department. I mean, I was really just talking with the officers, even the police union head. It's a very different attitude there. I mean, they're much more open, their whole sense of our job is to be responsive to the public. A few weeks later, I was in Pittsburgh. Terrible police department. Just terrible place. And recently was a major suit by the ACLU and the Justice Department, which ordered all sorts of changes in the department. And it was because over the years they've had just a very bad attitude of not responding to the public and so on. So there are really some extremely important differences between police departments. And I think what makes the difference is the kind of leadership you get first from City Hall, from the mayor's office, and then from the police chief's office.
With regard to this administration, the last administration, doesn't make any difference which, but the whole issue of community policing, do you feel that the community at large, given the attitude in the last election and I'm for it, and the other opponent says I'm against it, for whatever reasons, that people in the city of Omaha really understand what community policing is?
No. Most people across the country don't understand it. There are an awful lot
It's kind of a nebulous term.
Yeah, it's a vague term. And so what you need to do is to go to particular cities where they're doing it. I spent some time in San Diego recently and got a feel for the kind of programs that they're doing there. That has a very specific kind of attempt to dealing with street drug dealing, and they have some neighborhoods have a serious prostitution, street walking problem, and they have some very specific, concrete tactics for dealing with that, which they work out in conjunction with the residents of the neighborhood.
When the city first talked about community policing in the last administration, and we sent officers to others, I think Portland
was a major one, absolutely.
Was a major one. They came back somewhat enthused, right. Knowing that there would have to be a lot of work done to make it happen. Right. But it was a go. And then we just, as far as I know, officially just abandoned a lot of the work that was done setting it up. But I do think that there was a spillover to some of the lieutenants and sergeants who are enacting in certain neighborhoods where, let's say, junk cars were a problem, and then those kinds of things, right, that lead to the deterioration of a neighborhood, and therefore it makes it easier for crime to slip in. And they work together, and they even help put together some of the ordinances to help and call city departments. I mean, all the city departments work together in some neighborhoods. The cops will call the public works or the permits and inspection and say, and so I mean, some people's enthusiasm carried through, but Omaha doesn't think it has community policing.
Well, it's always been the case that you've had very bright and energetic, talented sergeants, lieutenants, and captains who've done some innovative things.
I would hope so.
That's always been the case. Then you have some that haven't. I think what the important part about community policing is it's a philosophy for the entire department. And it's not just, one or two individuals off on their own, being creative, but the whole department doing it.
We haven't even started the search for a new police chief, and obviously they want to wait till this lawsuit is settled regarding whether or not they can give up their civil service protection. But and certainly no police chief would want to come in from out of town or
Right.
anything under that circumstance without that cloud.
That's a major point. I don't think you're going to get a really talented person from outside the city. And you ought to do a national search because you want to get the best and let Omaha's officers who want to apply for the job compete against the best from around the country, see how they're going to do. No person of any talent is really going to want to come here where you have this uncertainty over what your legal status is. So the mayor ought to just drop this proposal, have the suit dismissed, write the job description and immediately and start the search.
I mean, one could wonder that depending on what happens in court with that it could be appealed by somebody, that could go.
This could go on forever. And I just want to point out that again, as the World Herald has pointed out, there are acting department heads in some other city agencies also.
We have a lot
And
of acting department
that's
heads.
a serious problem. That's a real serious problem.
Just from, you've done police administration studies and that, but just from what you know about administration management in general, what kind of a feeling does that give any department, police department, any public safety or public entity department, or I suppose any department anywhere?
Any organization.
When that sort of situation hangs over for a long time.
It's very disruptive. It's true in private business. It's true at the university. If there's a vacuum at the top and you don't know who your leader's going to be.
So you have a standstill at best.
Yes, and it's really, I think, a very serious situation.
Let's talk about, and I don't want to make this acting police chief thumping, police thumping, Mayor Dobb thumping, but we do. We left a mayoral race with, I believe, some racial tension after that, and I think anybody would be foolish to say that there wasn't some tension created during that election with police issues, actually, regarding the police union statements and the concern about the David Rice letters that Brenda Council had written and so on and so forth. But this has added a whole new dimension. I'm not saying anyone's right or wrong, but just from looking at what has happened in the police, in the dissemination of information by the police department. I'm not talking about the records, I'm just talking about help look at it with some of your outside viewing as to what this is pretty typical of what could happen when you have what might be perceived as a racially motivated shooting.
A number of people I've talked to felt that the sort of the race relations, the relations between the police and the African American community certainly is worse than it's been in decades. And I think there's a sort of an attitude problem that really comes out of City Hall of not establishing an attitude of openness and responsiveness. Now the good news is we're not Pittsburgh. We aren't that bad. We're not Philadelphia, which is maybe one of the worst departments in the entire country. But again, we're not Charlotte, North Carolina. We're not Portland. We're not San Diego either, where there's a much more open and responsive atmosphere where it's let's sit down and work these things out.
I'm getting the feeling though that there's just a total lack of communication even in the department as to what they even want to communicate to the public. They're not doing any talking. The police chief, in past years, the mayor would call the police chief in and would say, Chief so-and-so, tell him what you have to tell him. Tell him the results of the internal affairs investigation. I mean, he would at least give the press and hopefully through the press or even in private meetings with public citizens, some feeling that there's some communication. We have not, even before the demand for all the records, we have not heard from our police chief. We've heard from the police union, which some officers say was maybe too much was said, but it was a reaction to the lack of communication by the leadership of our police chief. And so,
well, I think the real problem here is that the police department's been speaking with two voices, and on one hand they tell the family, no, we can't release all this information. But yet, immediately after the shooting, I mean, you had the police union head was speaking to the public, revealing all sorts of information, and so it's saying it can't do one thing, but then some police officials go and go ahead and do it. There's some real hypocrisy here that I think needs to be corrected.
Do police departments, and I know that when you look at police departments all over the country, maybe you don't get into the nitty-gritty, such as, what is the policy, legally viable policy and just practical policy of releasing any information other than a court order or a discovery motion or whatever? I mean, I'm totally confused as a member of the news media now, what we can even get, because it's waffled.
There are different sets of information and different audiences. So it's one thing to disclose the information privately to members of the family. Mm-hmm. This is a way of alleviating answering their concerns. It's another thing to disclose it publicly to the news media.
Absolutely.
And there may be a lot of things you wouldn't want to say that, but you can still release it privately to the family.
But we seem to not even know what we are going to do in either situation.
Right. And then it's gotten all tangled up here in Omaha because of the grand jury proceeding. Well, the proceedings of the grand jury are secret, but that doesn't mean that they can't release other some information that may or may not be submitted to the grand jury. And the grand jury testimony is secret, but other information can be released. I think the real lesson of what's going on around the country, the better departments, the ones that have alleviated their racial tensions, they have opted on the side of openness, being open, being responsive. It was really very, very interesting in Portland. I met with the commander of internal affairs, and his basic line was, we're here to respond. We're here to respond when you get a complaint. We want to deal with that and handle it and respond to the people who are complaining and resolve the problem one way or another. So there's just an atmosphere, an attitude of responsiveness had really, I think, permeated the department, even in internal affairs.
I conducted a little experiment. I don't think ever before in my life have I found out something that would have been newsworthy. I knew it would come out anyway. And I wanted to see how long the police department sat on it. It was over a week from the time that this officer Sears was cleared by internal affairs and the time they released it. And I don't know if they released it or the World Herald called them, but I knew that they had cleared him, and it just sat there and wallowed. And I felt sorry for the police officers, not just Officer Sears, but I felt sorry for the whole officership that's going through its kind of agony. And I think when an officer is involved in a shooting, they go through some different kinds of real strong emotions.
Sure. I think the current situation has damaged everybody. The community as a whole, obviously the family, but also the police department and individual officers, because it's created so much uproar and so much suspicion of the police that affects those officers who are doing a good job.
And in turn could affect them on the street, not maybe how they're treated or perceived, but their confidence factor or how they feel they're perceived.
Yeah,
I mean, these are the kinds of things that I think as citizens we don't really think, the psychology of being a police officer.
I think it's probably hurt the morale of the police department quite a bit. And I would have to guess that not having a permanent police chief hurts the morale. You're sort of in limbo. You don't know what's going to happen next week or next month. I mean, it's a very bad situation.
Let's look a little bit to something besides some of the current things. As you look at the Omaha and let's say all the metro police departments around, what have been some of the best things that have happened over the years? Although you have some doubts about what has happened, but
well, I think in Omaha specifically, I think one of the things they have done, and despite the Ammons shooting, the number of fatal shootings has actually gone down. I mean, really, very, very few. Last year I did this evaluation of the Albuquerque Police Department. They were just off the charts. They had shot and killed 30 people in the previous 10 years, which was an average of 3 a year for 10 years. Oh. And so I compiled a chart, and Omaha, looked very, very good. So, as in most departments, the fatal shootings have really been brought under control. That's a tremendously positive achievement. Now, the other thing that I noticed in Albuquerque was that so many of the fatal shootings were not racial, but it was an adult male with a gun who was having a mental breakdown. We had we had these barricade situations and hostage situations. Mm-hmm. There was one just this week.
There seems to be one about every week, and I think around the holidays there tend to be more.
There are a lot of them, and I started paying closer attention to them in Omaha, and my impression is that Omaha does a pretty good job at that. There was one last summer. You got a guy at the med center, had a gun, had barricaded himself in the men's room. Well, they talked him down. Now, there's some other departments where they talk him up. I mean, they sort of escalate it up and it becomes a shooting incident and a real tragedy. So I have the feeling that Omaha is doing a pretty good job on these barricade, hostage kind of situations. So I think that's very, very positive.
Negotiating skills seem to be pretty good. Their SWAT teams, or they like to call them emergency response units here, seem to have not be get too hyped up too easily.
No, here, it's usually a small news story for about half a day, and that's a good thing. Again, one of the problems in policing is that good news doesn't travel very far. I mean, only bad news, like the Ammons case, that travels pretty far. So we don't really, hear about the good things. So I think there are some fairly positive things that have in fact occurred.
Well, I know you don't get as fine tuned as budgets and everything, but across the country, what kinds of investments, physical investments, besides officers and the salaries and training, although I think that's probably an issue almost everywhere where dollars are short, what are the kinds of things that are money that's being spent on police departments besides officers' salaries? What are the things that need to be done more? Is training an issue?
Training is an issue, but again, it needs to be very, very specific in terms of a particular problem. Whether it's hostage negotiations, I mean, there's some departments that don't do a very good job. They need to do something, but others are in
Besides
fact,
helicopters, what are the things?
Don't get me started on helicopters. I really think though that the issue isn't so much money. I mean, I think the issue is how can we efficiently and effectively use the resources we have, and it's really much more of an attitude question rather than a money question. Now, there are some departments that are terribly underfunded, where salaries really are bad. New Orleans, for example. New Orleans, one of the worst police departments absolutely in the country. Well, the salaries are just awful. And one, you don't get good people, and two, it encourages graft. So you do have to keep the salaries up. I think Omaha's doing a pretty good job in that score in terms of being able to attract good people. But I really think money and equipment is not the answer. The answer is attitude.
Okay, well, we've run out of time. That's my attitude on that.
Great.
And I'm giving you a little more time. We'll get you back later and talk about that helicopter.
Okay.
Giving that helicopter a little more time, okay?
Yep.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Professor Sam Walker, thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining us on Consider This.